row of bulldozers shimmering under the Sahel sun. No donor flags, no foreign ambassadors, no smiling IMF officials pretending generosity. Just machines, silent yet thunderous, declaring sovereignty in steel. In an era where nations like Nigeria drown in oil yet still borrow, where Kenya celebrates technology but kneels to the World Bank, where South Africa boasts platinum yet remains chained to foreign lenders, a landlocked, sanctioned nation just shattered the script. Burkina Faso, written off as fragile, lined up 764 machines, financed not with loans, not with aid, but with its own reclaimed wealth. This is not charity. This is not pity. This is sovereignty bulldozed into existence. And that single act ignited a question that haunts the continent. If a small Sahelian state can build without donors, what excuse remains for Africa's so-called giants? Stay with us. This is not just a headline, it is a hinge in African history. Subscribe and stand with the story. But here lies the deeper truth. Those machines were more than construction tools. They were symbols, declarations, and warnings. The story of how they appeared is the story of a nation daring to reclaim its dignity. The day was blazing hot in Ouagadougou. Dust hung in the air, the kind of dust that carries the weight of centuries. The dust of empire, of hunger, of promises unkept. Yet under that same sun, something extraordinary unfolded. Row after row of heavy-duty machines, bulldozers, graders, compactors, excavators, gleamed like an army of steel. They were not second-hand donations stamped with EU insignia. They were not token gifts paraded by smiling ambassadors. They were brand new, bought and paid for with Burkina Faso's own money. No IMF delegation hovered in the background. No World Bank representative cut ribbons. No European minister delivered speeches about fiscal discipline. This was a Burkina Faso affair. Finance delivered, unveiled by the state itself. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, standing in his trademark military attire, did not give a long lecture. He did not thank foreign donors. He did not plead for validation. He simply let the machines speak. And speak they did. Their silent alignment under the Sahel sky became louder than any speech. Every blade of steel whispered the same message. Africa can build Africa. For decades, Africans were conditioned to believe that development could only come with a donor's blessing, that sovereignty was too expensive for small nations. But here was proof, tangible, undeniable proof, that another path was possible. For most of the continent, infrastructure has long been paraded as charity. A bridge becomes a photo opportunity for foreign officials. A highway ribbon is tied with the colors of some international partnership. Hospitals carry plaques praising friends from abroad. Generations grew up equating progress with dependency. But in Ouagadougou, the silence was deafening. No donor logos, no speeches of gratitude, no applause for external benefactors. Instead, there was dignity. Raw, unfiltered dignity. These machines, lined up like soldiers, declared independence in a language the world could not ignore. The symbolism struck deep. Burkina Faso, dismissed as small and weak, had just embarrassed Africa's largest economies. Nigeria with its oil wealth, Kenya with its tech hubs, South Africa with its industrial base, all remained tethered to loans and aid. Yet a nation under sanctions had delivered what they could not: development without dependency. The announcement sent shockwaves across the continent. Some commentators tried to downplay it, calling it a symbolic gesture. Others suggested the machines would soon break down. But the truth gnawed at them. Burkina Faso had achieved something larger nations had failed to do. It wasn't just about machines, it was about exposing excuses. Because those rows of steel weren't merely about roads. They were about pride. They were about restoring the belief that sovereignty was not a dream for future generations, but a possibility today. For the ordinary Burkinabe watching, it was the first time in living memory that their government delivered not borrowed promises, but sovereign reality. This was not a charity showcase. It was not a photo op for donors. It was sovereignty bulldozed into existence. A message etched in steel, shimmering in the sun, reverberating across Africa. And so the question lingered like dust in the air. If Burkina Faso, landlocked and under siege, could do this, what excuse did Africa's giants have left? But behind those machines lay a deeper secret. Steel may shine on the surface, but the fuel that powered this revolution was hidden underground, waiting to be claimed. Where did the money come from? The answer lies not in loans, but in the veins of gold beneath Burkinabe soil. The unveiling of 764 machines was not just a domestic event, it was a continental earthquake. Across Africa, News anchors, analysts, and citizens scrambled to make sense of what they had just witnessed. How could a landlocked nation, written off as fragile, manage to deliver what oil-rich Nigeria, tech-driven Kenya, and mineral-powered South Africa had failed to achieve? The answer, though simple, was painful. Dependency was never destiny. It was a choice. And Burkina Faso had just chosen differently. Reactions rippled across capitals. In Abuja, commentators muttered excuses. The scale was exaggerated, sustainability questionable. In Nairobi, opinion pieces tried to frame it as a one-off spectacle. In Pretoria, elites dismissed it as political theater. Yet the images spoke louder than words. Lines of bulldozers under the Sahel sun became an indictment against every leader who continued to plead for aid. Ordinary Africans, however, heard something different. They saw courage where others saw risk. They saw sovereignty where others feared isolation. Social media lit up with pride, anger, and disbelief. Memes compared Burkina Faso's machines to Nigeria's oil rigs, rusting under mismanagement. Posts asked why Kenya, with its global recognition as a tech hub, still bowed to World Bank dictates. Citizens in Johannesburg wondered aloud how a sanctioned state managed feats that their industrial powerhouse could not. It was humiliation wrapped in inspiration. On one hand, the sight was uplifting, proof that Africa could stand on its own. On the other, it was bitter, proof that excuses of "we are too poor, too small, too dependent" had always been lies. Internationally, the silence was telling. No Western diplomat congratulated Ouagadougou. No IMF statement praised the bold move. Instead, whispers filled the halls of Washington, Brussels, and Paris. Terms like investor confidence, risk to stability, and unsustainable populism echoed in reports. The message was clear. What terrified them was not the machines themselves, but the precedent they set. If Burkina Faso could reclaim its wealth and invest directly, why not Mali? Why not Niger? Why not the rest of Africa? And then there was the symbolism. These machines were not abstract policy. They were not slogans and speeches. They were physical, immovable proof that sovereignty was possible. Unlike words, they could not be dismissed as rhetoric. Unlike promises, they could not evaporate in bureaucracy. They stood on Burkinabe soil, unshakable, undeniable. This is why the reaction was so visceral. Africa's elites were unsettled not because of bulldozers, but because of what they represented: the collapse of excuses. For decades, aid dependency had been normalized, justified, even celebrated. Leaders paraded donor conferences as achievements, while their citizens clapped at the art of begging. But Ouagadougou flipped the script. No foreign flags, no external applause, just sovereign delivery. And yet behind the pride lay a deeper question. How was it possible? Burkina Faso, with limited reserves under sanctions, facing security challenges, managed to purchase an entire fleet. Machines of that scale do not appear out of thin air. They are bought, paid for, transported, and delivered. The world wanted answers. Critics demanded transparency. Supporters celebrated boldness. But in the end, all eyes turned to the same place: the source of Burkina Faso's new strength. Because the secret was not in speeches. It was not in diplomatic maneuvers. It was in the veins of gold running through Burkinabe soil, wealth long stolen, finally reclaimed. And that is where the story takes its sharpest turn. For the first time since independence, gold would no longer build European fortunes while Burkinabe starved. Gold would build roads, hospitals, and schools. But how did this transformation unfold? The answer lies in a radical shift that shook both investors abroad and elites at home. Gold. For decades, it glittered in Burkinabe soil, but its shine illuminated European capitals, not the villages of the Sahel. Burkina Faso became one of Africa's top gold producers, yet its citizens remained among the poorest. Foreign corporations, aided by complicit local elites, extracted tons of ore, refined it abroad, and sold it on global markets. The state collected crumbs, taxes barely enough to pay bureaucrats, while donors filled the gap with aid, demanding gratitude for what was already stolen wealth. Captain Ibrahim Traoré changed the rules. Mines once operated as private vaults for outsiders were placed under national control. Contracts designed to siphon profits overseas were suspended or rewritten. Foreign operators were told bluntly that the age of plunder was over. Gold would no longer be Europe's lifeline. It would be Burkina Faso's backbone. The effect was immediate. For the first time, the treasury brimmed with sovereign money. Not borrowed, not donated, not conditioned. With that money came visible results. Hospitals rose in provincial towns. New buses rolled through city streets. Processing plants for rice and tomatoes opened, breaking cycles of agricultural waste. And most symbolically, 764 machines stood ready to carve roads across forgotten landscapes. This visibility mattered. For ordinary Burkina sovereignty was no longer a distant slogan. It was tangible, painted in steel and concrete. Citizens could point to projects and say, "This is ours, not a donor's gift." That shift in perception may prove as revolutionary as the projects themselves. But the consequences stretch beyond infrastructure. Politically, the reclamation of gold redrew the social contract. For decades, rulers survived on donor lifelines, accountable more to Western financiers than to their own citizens. By cutting the pipeline of aid, Traoré forced his government to live and die by national revenue. Suddenly, loyalty was measured not by foreign connections, but by delivery to the people. This was a governance revolution. Corruption, long fed by donor funds, began to suffocate. The networks of rent seekers who thrived on managing aid projects found themselves starved. Without donor money to siphon, they faced a choice: adapt to the new order or wither. The international reaction was predictable. Western capitals fretted about investor confidence. Reports warned of fiscal irresponsibility. But for ordinary Africans watching, the message was electrifying. If gold could be reclaimed, what else could? It was here, in this moment of transformation, that the significance of the Ibrahim Traoré coup came into sharp relief. For his critics, it was just another power grab in a continent weary of military rulers. But for his supporters, the coup was more than a political shift. It was the ignition point of sovereignty. By seizing power, Traoré seized the chance to rewrite the rules of exploitation. The domestic impact was profound. Markets once flooded with imported rice and wheat began to see local products. Farmers, long neglected, received seeds, equipment, and irrigation support. The shift was not merely economic. It was psychological. Hunger, once manipulated as a weapon of control, was now being dismantled. And yet challenges remained. Gold could build machines, but it could not feed a nation. Agriculture became the next battlefield. Food sovereignty was framed not as charity, but as survival. Every sack of imported rice represented leverage in foreign hands. To break it was to cut the cord that had bound Burkina Faso for generations. For citizens, the message was clear. Sovereignty was not an abstract speech in parliament. It was a daily reality. In the roads they walked, the food they ate, the hospitals they entered. For the first time in decades, independence was no longer a historical memory. It was alive. But even gold and grain could be undone by one deadly enemy: corruption. If wealth was redirected into private pockets, sovereignty would collapse before it began. That was the next frontier in Burkina Faso's struggle. A war not against donors or hunger, but against betrayal from within. The silence from Western capitals spoke volumes. When Burkina Faso unveiled its 764 machines, no congratulatory messages flowed from Washington, Paris, or Brussels. Instead, the language of caution filled reports: risk to stability, damage to investor confidence, unsustainable populism. In truth, the unease was not about fiscal policy. It was about precedent. If one small, sanctioned nation could reclaim its wealth and finance development independently, what stopped others? In Mali, citizens already questioned why gold continued to enrich foreign corporations. In Niger, uranium still powered French lights while Niamey endured blackouts. In South Africa, the industrial giant of the continent, elites feared the optics, that their people would ask why a struggling Sahelian state could deliver dignity while they remained tethered to loans. Regional bodies reacted predictably. ECOWAS, already rattled by waves of military takeovers, viewed Ouagadougou's boldness as both a challenge and a contagion. The African Union called for dialogue and stability, careful not to endorse the symbolism that threatened donor dependence across the continent. International institutions worried about fiscal discipline, but the irony was sharp. Decades of loans had entrenched poverty, not solved it. Burkina Faso's experiment threatened to expose this hypocrisy. By using its own gold revenues to buy machines and invest in agriculture, it showed that sovereignty could be more sustainable than debt. For ordinary Africans, the symbolism was undeniable. This was not another donor project branded with logos. It was dignity in action. It reminded the continent that dependency is not natural law, but a political choice. That is why the announcement stung, not because of machines, but because of what they represented. Courage in the face of pressure. The world called it risk. Burkina Faso called it dignity. And in that tension lies the true weight of the Burkina Faso Revolution. Yet one truth lingered like a shadow. Gold and food could restore sovereignty. But without confronting corruption, the parasite within, the revolution risked becoming hollow. And that was the battlefield Ibrahim Traoré chose next. Gold could buy machines. Agriculture could feed people. But sovereignty would remain fragile if corruption hollowed it from within. That was the reality Ibrahim Traoré confronted. In Burkina Faso, decades of foreign aid had created a class of rent-seekers who thrived not on production, but on dependency. Ministers, bureaucrats, and NGOs managed donor pipelines, skimming off the flow while ordinary citizens starved. Aid did not fight corruption, it institutionalized it. By cutting the aid pipeline, Traoré dealt a surgical strike. The parasites lost their oxygen. For the first time, the state could not hide behind external lifelines. It had to govern with its own money, answerable to its own people. Projects became visible, buses on city streets, hospitals rising in towns, processing plants operating in rural areas. Visibility killed corruption's favorite weapon, secrecy. But Traoré went further. Officials accused of embezzlement were removed. Loyalty was no longer measured by ties to donor networks, but by service to the nation. Governance itself was redefined. Sovereignty was no longer a hollow slogan. It became a contract between state and citizen, written in steel and soil. The implications stretched far beyond Burkina Faso. Across Africa, leaders had long excused corruption as inevitable, a cultural flaw, or an inherited curse. But Ouagadougou showed another truth. Corruption is not destiny, it is a parasite. Starve it and it dies. For citizens in Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, Bamako, and Kinshasa, the message was unmistakable. Sovereignty is possible now, if leaders dare to choose it. This was not an easy road. It was harder, riskier, lonelier. But it was also the only road that promised dignity. Machines without governance would rust. Gold without transparency would vanish. Food without accountability would rot. Only when sovereignty and governance walked hand in hand could independence endure. Burkina Faso had chosen the harder path, not the road of dependency, but the road of dignity. And in that choice, it offered Africa a mirror. The reflection was sharp, uncomfortable, undeniable. If a landlocked nation under sanctions could reclaim its wealth, feed its people, and confront corruption, then what excuse remained for richer states? The world was watching. The continent was listening. And the question lingered like a challenge echoing across the savannah. If one small nation can take this road, what stops the rest of Africa? Rows of machines, veins of gold, fields of grain. Together they formed more than projects. They formed a fortress of sovereignty. Yet the real foundation was not steel or soil, but the courage to choose dignity over dependency. That choice is what sets Burkina Faso apart. For too long, Africa's story has been narrated by outsiders. Bridges inaugurated by donors, highways stamped with foreign flags, hospitals branded with the generosity of others. Dependency was paraded as progress, while sovereignty was dismissed as impossible. But Ouagadougou tore that script apart. By reclaiming its gold, by feeding its people, by confronting corruption, Burkina Faso reminded the continent of a simple truth. Poverty was not inevitable. It was engineered. Dependency was not destiny. It was a political choice. This is why the story resonates beyond its borders. In Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, Bamako, and Kinshasa, citizens now ask harder questions. If a landlocked, sanctioned nation can deliver dignity, what excuse remains for the giants of the continent? If sovereignty can be built with courage, why should billions still bow to lenders? And here lies the weight of the Ibrahim Traoré coup. Critics may frame it as another episode in Africa's cycle of instability. But for many it is remembered as the spark that lit a revolution of sovereignty. For in its wake came bulldozers bought with sovereign money, hospitals funded with national gold, fields planted with dignity. That is why the world must reckon with the Burkina Faso Revolution. It is not merely a story about one country. It is a mirror held to the whole continent. It forces every leader, every citizen, to confront the excuses that have shackled progress for generations. So the question echoes once more. If Burkina Faso can stand without the West, what stops the rest of Africa? If this story stirs your sense of justice, do not look away. Subscribe, share, and join this journey. Because sovereignty is not tomorrow's dream, it is today's choice. And Africa's future begins when its nations dare to choose dignity,